A very good afternoon. A very good afternoon to everyone who has joined us today. On behalf of the entire Dark team, I'm excited and elated to welcome everyone to the 11th Dark Baithak. The Dark is a book review journal which publishes original book reviews across disciplines and genres. An initiative of the Dark, the Baithak, is our humble attempt to build a space for young scholars and students to critically engage with ideas and experiences. In previous bed talks, we have hosted scholars whose work has dealt with such questions of cinema, security and strategy, digital space and memes, gender, marginality, and politics of space, among others. The session title today is Beyond the Rite of Passage Attending to Vulnerability in Fieldwork Praxis. As speaker for the session, we have with us Dr. Meenakshi and Ambujam, who is a Swiss National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford's International Development Department. She earned her PhD in anthropology and sociology from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, Switzerland. Her research interests span two domains. The first lies at the intersection of land, materiality, and bureaucracy, while the second dwells on the ethnographic method and the relational vulnerabilities field workers may encounter. Her writings have appeared in the Swiss Journal of Sociocultural Anthropology, the Land Portal, and elsewhere. For with us today, our discussant is Jigeesha Bhargavi, who is a first-year master student at Ambedkar University. We welcome everyone. Uh, Meenakshi, we generally have the speaker share their ideas and their presentation for 25 to 30 minutes, post which the discussant comes in and they share their insights or any questions that they may have. After that, we open the floor for questions or doubts that the participants may have. So, if you're comfortable, we can begin now.
Perfect. So I'm just going to quickly share my slides. Um, and in the meantime, so I'm hoping everything is visible. Um, so, firstly, thank you everybody for being here because I know it's a Saturday and it's 4 p.m. and I'm pretty sure that everybody has other things to do. So, you've prioritized this. So, thank you so much. And also, thank you to Chetna and the entire Dark Baithak team, Jigeesha, for also taking the time to read because these are all, how do you put it? It's you're sharing your time and expertise and experience and etc. And I don't take that lightly. I think that it's a valuable work of labor and care that you're all putting in. So I genuinely appreciate that. Um, so this presentation today actually draws on my experience of conducting fieldwork in Telangana when I was doing my doctoral research. Um, so at the outset, I just want to clarify a couple of things. So the thing is that vulnerability, of course, takes many shapes and forms, right? I mean, there's the vulnerability of caste, class, gender, ability, disability, finances, and more. But my talk today primarily will focus on sexualized harassment in the fields with one form of vulnerability. And I know that this is a sensitive topic, and it's not something that we often hear in classrooms when we discuss the method of undertaking fieldwork. So I just wanted to share at the outset that there will be examples of sexualized harassment. So if it is too much, I apologize in advance, but I just thought that it's important to also sort of show that fieldwork is messy. It is not very sanitized. It's not plain and simple, you know. So there are all of these other layers to it that we may want to consider. Um, so for me, the motivation behind this entire work, to probe the complexities and fractures in the in the practice of fieldwork, emerged from trying to make sense of, well, retrospectively, of specific events. And to be honest, before I experienced sexualized harassment in the field, despite all the preparation, because when you undertake doctoral research, as many of you know, you do your pilots, you do like a bunch of preliminary field work. So all of that went smoothly in my case. And I'd also not come across very many texts that were discussing these aspects. Like we would read ethnographies in my training. So I'm trained as an anthropologist primarily. So we would read all of these things, but you didn't really grapple with what entails fieldwork, because we know that everybody does it differently, but it wasn't something that I really pondered upon. So while I'd indeed read and reflected on works discussing positionality, reciprocity, what it meant to be a native anthropologist doing fieldwork back home rather than outside, very little of my reading examined, let's say, the embodied experiences of field workers, especially when it came to sexualized harassment. So, in this vein, Rebecca Hansen and Patricia Richards' book Harassed was pertinent, and I only came across this after my fieldwork, but I came across this at a very important juncture, and it opens with a very poignant statement as well. So, it says. It should perhaps come as little surprise that women researchers face sexualized harassment and violence while conducting field research. So, if this is so common or is something that one should not be so surprised about, then why is it that very little is spoken about harassment in the field? And why is it that we do not read works that discuss this in doctoral classrooms or master's classrooms or any discussion that delves into field work, right? And a clue may lie in Sarah Delamont's rejoinder to Amy Pollard's essay. This essay by Amy Pollard came at a time when she herself was a doctoral student. She was based in the UK. And she spoke to a bunch of researchers to figure out what are the range of vulnerabilities that doctoral students were facing at the time or what they faced. So they listed fear, shame, guilt, being silenced, being stressed, being trapped, being harassed, among others. Of course, Amy Pollard, her positionality, of course, is of a global North scholar who's also white. And I mean, we have to take all of that into consideration, but some of this can also be very revealing. So what Sarah Delamont wrote to Amy Pollard's essay when she said that, okay, these are the range of experiences that doctoral researchers are facing, and there's a lot of complexity in doing fieldwork. um, Delamont wrote this that the habitus of the discipline of anthropology relies on a widespread agreement that not everyone can be an anthropologist, and the survival of the misery and the bafflement of fieldwork is the best way to see who is and who is not fit to join this culture. You know, and as you read through the rest of that paragraph, you'll realize that this sentiment is also not unique because Sarah Delamont is a celebrated anthropologist, and it's coming from her perspective as well. And when you retrace Hansen and Richard's book and the book Harassed, and you go back to what they say, some of these things can be instructive because they say that although we recognize that social norms, cultural codes, and the social worlds we study inform experiences of harassment, our analysis situates the problem not in those worlds, but rather in the academic community itself. And I think this is key to remember that, of course, sexual harassment is part of the social worlds we inhabit, but the university is where finally we all work, where we are all situated at. It's the academic space. And some of the researchers that we're talking about, they're master's students, they're, early careers. So there is a form of vulnerability that comes in because it's not about hand holding a student, but just opening the discussion that fieldwork can be messy and it has to be thought not of as a rite of passage. Especially in anthropology, it's very critical that you go do this year-long fieldwork or whatever it is to make your research possible, but there are all of these other nuances to it that requires a little bit of thought. Now, in the Indian context, Jayashilan Raj's book, Plantation Crisis, and I really recommend that everybody reads it, if not the book, at least the preface, because it's a beautifully written preface that's also very evocative. So, in one of the pages, he writes, and to contextualize, Jayashilan Raj is a Dalit anthropologist who's working amongst plantation workers. So it is of somebody who's also studying their own community, and this positionality becomes important in what I'm about to just read. Doing fieldwork in one's own community is a challenge not only in terms of how you choose to position yourself in it, but also how you're already positioned within the plantation cosmology and its categorical relationships. He then says, I was constantly enmeshed in the complexities of identity as I negotiated my path through plantation life. In distant tea estates where I did not know people, I would be asked leading questions indicative of my caste and social origin. I was often asked by workers if I had any relatives in tea estates that I visited. Giving the names of my relatives in the estates would position me in terms of caste and family reputation. This was mainly done by upper caste managerial staff, trade union leaders, government officials who wanted to put me in my place. Their narratives were often filled with sarcasm and stereotypical images about Tamil plantation workers. And then he concludes the discussion by saying such discussions, that is of caste and of the position of the researcher, who's a Dalit researcher undertaking research, do not pay due attention to the vulnerability of those ethnographers who are not treated on par with some of the population within the socio-political hierarchies of societies they write about. The precariousness of being a Dalit while doing fieldwork in the Indian countryside is indeed revealing, and so on and so forth. Now, why I draw on Jaishalan Raj's work at this point is to show that vulnerability seeps into fieldwork in ways that are not often discussed in classrooms, but also the idea of a field worker is sometimes placed as this person who is evacuated of any social markers except when we discuss positionality, and then it is done like a checklist. But what Jaishalan Raj's work does is that, let's say, me as a privileged Savarna person doing research and him not so much, even our access is conditioned based on the social norms that they're there. So what we can and cannot do is primarily then, it sort of enlivens forms of vulnerability. It enlivens forms of, humiliation or dehumanizing that we could face. And these are all important to discuss when we think of fieldwork as a methodological practice, because it is a method. Finally, there is an episteme to it. But however, as I said earlier, this talk primarily focuses on sexualized harassment, but I just wanted to put this out there to show that vulnerability operates across different axes. Um, so, as I said earlier, when we then start examining and probing fieldwork as an episteme, as a practice, we quickly realize that the fieldworker is often constructed as a gender neutral or a masculine subject. And this is something that comes across in many works now, because right now you have more and more people writing about it. And this discounts the experiences of everybody else. So it could be the BIPOC communities of Black, Indigenous, people of color. It could be LGBTQI plus people. It could be people from oppressed or non-dominant castes, and of course women as well, whose bodies intrinsically shape and impact fieldwork practices, because what we're able to do is finally dependent on our embodied experience, but also who we are. In the Indian context, then, caste is critical, and a particular reification of the image of the field worker also occurs, right? Because we think of the field worker as a lone warrior who braves the storms, through sheer grit of character, very Indiana Jones like. And this is seen as the mark of a good field worker, that, you have to go through this and, have your battles and come back with wounds of the warriors, and then you've done legitimate field work. Um, so this image of a heroic field worker thus is revered, and it is perhaps even unwittingly aspirational, because when we all go to field work, at least when I was doing, at least in my training, there was this unsaid but also open public secret of sorts, that if you haven't been through some difficulty, you're not doing something right. And taking breaks is not okay, because you need to, like, go through the grind, and you need to just go through something. Like, it had to be this like this gargantuan process that you had to, like, go through. So how do researchers themselves situate uh, their bodies in this space, or especially as they experience, encounter, and navigate gendered and embodied vulnerabilities? And this becomes especially important in the context in which people do research in India today, because it's not very easy, and I leave it at that. Um, so I turn to the concept of relational vulnerabilities, which Naila Kabir uses when discussing the context of violence against women, to fully understand the layered and highly dynamic nature of gender and power relations. The term, she says, allows her to conceive violence against women as embedded in highly asymmetrical social relationships and the associated dependencies. In the context of fieldwork, too, thinking in terms of this term has some merits. It equips us to better understand the embodied experiences of researchers, especially along the lines of gender, caste, class, and race, disability, and so on. It compels us to see vulnerability as relational but also intersectional. It troubles the assumption of the anthropological field workers as just powerful pen wielding people constructing narratives, controlling the field, and producing ethnographic truths. Instead, relational vulnerability situates the field worker or the researcher in a network that demonstrates the highly fluid nature of power relations. So, being a female researcher, for instance, transforms how access to the field is negotiated and established. And identifying as a member of the LGBTQI plus community can drastically change how a field worker experiences the field, the risks that may come with it, depending on the countries and the context. So, being oblivious to these critical differences produces partial and biased narratives of fieldwork as well, and they perpetuate disciplinary silences around sexualized harassment, around violence, around trauma, so on and so forth. Um, so now I'll basically just reflect on two moments that were important in my fieldwork to sort of grapple with what fieldwork meant to me. Um, so, uh, and these come from portions of either the article that I've written, but also interspersed with diary notes at the time. Um, so, coming back from home before sunset was an essential safety strategy of my fieldwork practice. One day in February 2019, I could not return from an Adivasi hamlet before sunset. My interlocutors had just begun to open up to me, and I accepted the request to extend my stay by 45 minutes. In my previous interactions with Adivasis, both in this hamlet and elsewhere, they told me how state officials and government functionaries were always in a hurry to get things done and would not spend any extra time. Therefore, I was keen on ensuring that my interlocutors could lay legitimate claims to my time as well, as I did with theirs, in an effort to build horizontal alliances. On my way back from home, I struggled to find. On my way back home, I struggled to find transportation, and after a long wait, I finally found a shared auto, one where several people travel together. So I hopped in because I felt I would be putting myself at risk by waiting, any longer because it's sunset and I'd already waited for a very long time. So I got into this share auto, and before I knew it, six men had gotten into the vehicle, and then I was assaulted through, from the time I hopped into the vehicle to the place that I was dropped off. Like during that 45 minutes, 50 minutes, or whatever, I was assaulted through that journey. Now, of course, I just want to be very clear that I'm not insinuating that the Adivasis assaulted me because I don't know who assaulted me. Like, six people assaulted me. That's all I know. But it could be anybody, right? Because non-Adivasis also stay in the same place. So this I just want to be very clear. Um, and the incident, like once it was done, like the words that stuck with me because I was about to pay was that, no, thank you, you've done enough. And and I went back home to my room. And what was interesting to me was that not only did I not speak about anything, like I was a little confused and like perhaps a little like disconnected with what had happened. But also the next day I showed up to field work, and I continued doing field work every day for the rest of whatever 13 months of field work that I did. Because the idea was that, oh, if I were to take a break right now, the dissertation is not going to go forward. And I was supported by a grant. So I was like, oh, what will the donor think? What will this? There were too many things that were going on. So I just continued with business as usual. But the incident also forced me to analyze and grapple with my own ethnographic fixations about power relations and how I had unwittingly internalized gender neutral notions of fieldwork. Because my decision to stay an extra 45 minutes that day, be outside after sunset, had violated certain patriarchal norms of the region, and being cognizant of anthropology's colonial past, I was also adamant about creating horizontal relationships of trust, friendship, and reciprocity, things I think are very fundamental in how we do our research, because that's the only way to do ethical research. But what I had overlooked was how some of these very notions were in conflict with patriarchal gender norms of the region as well, where women were expected and required to operate and function a certain way. And there was also a form of privilege that kept crept in, right? Where I thought that this wouldn't happen to me because I'm an outsider. And it sort of challenges multiple levels of power because you also see yourself as outside because you come from a position of privilege, but suddenly that position of privilege is also sort of unsettled a little bit. So, approaching fieldwork through the lens of relational vulnerabilities then centers the engendered, embodied body of the researcher at the core, and then it unsettles and reveals the many assumptions of power relations we have in the field. And all of this is based in a certain way on the idea of a masculinist field worker or a male field worker. Not that both of them are synonymous, but you know but the second incident is not even a physical incident, but it was still very interesting. And this happened a few months when I moved to my next field work, and this was at a state bureaucracy um, where I was studying up. And herein again, what happened was I had shared my phone number with a senior officer who offered to connect me with other officials, and he proceeded to call me several times a day, often inebriated. And anybody who researches bureaucracy in India knows that access is notoriously difficult. So any little bit, if somebody gives you a small thread, you hang on to it like it's a rope. So none of his calls, of course, had anything to do with my research. Instead, he would ask me if I lived alone, if I had food, if I was expected to be at the bureaucracy each day. And because I'm not from Telangana, but I spoke Telugu, there was this thing that, oh, your Telugu is very cute. It has this, non-Teluguishness to the Telugu. I don't know. But and he'd also, of course, make sexually suggestive remarks and would say that he considered me a very good friend and wanted and expected me to reciprocate the friendship. I tried expressing my discomfort regarding these calls, the nature of questions that I was being asked, but I also knew that I could not avoid him or his calls because he was a senior officer who was, in a certain way, the gatekeeper to my field. He had the power to affect access to my organization, and I very well knew that I could not afford to offend him in any way. And because I was studying up, I could acutely feel the asymmetrical nature of power relations that I was navigating. And in contrast to especially in contrast to the organization like the state bureaucracy, its officials, both of which I researched, I, the researcher, occupied a position of fragility, right? Where everything could change in a matter of seconds. And this was only made more complex by gender and the associated vulnerabilities that came with it. In any other context, and this is what was baffling to me in my head, that I would have called this sexualized harassment. But in the context of field work, I just did not have the vocabulary to articulate what I was experiencing at that time. I rationalized that this was part and parcel of fieldwork and something that my work demanded of me, and I tried to let it go. And the reason I say this is because there are ways in which I interact with strangers outside of fieldwork. So if somebody were to offer me a ride, I wouldn't take it. If somebody were to offer me food, I wouldn't take it because I don't know who these people are, right? But when you're doing fieldwork, each of this is a possibility. It's like, okay, this allows us to do something. Sharing your phone number. I mean, during fieldwork, I don't know how often my phone number circulated beyond the bounds of relationships that I thought. It just went further and further away. But otherwise, I'm a very private individual, that I like there are things that you do just because it's field work. And fieldwork requires us to do that because it requires you to be curious, it requires you to be receptive, it requires you to be open to possibilities. Um, it requires you to share your life because that's also how you build trust. It's also how you, it's only by sharing that you can build these relationships because they're not, it shouldn't be extractivist research either. And it is this constant tussle that as field workers we need to navigate, something that can only help, and it's only through these ways that you can actually build meaningful relationships with your interlocutors and learn. But at the same time, we also don't talk about how it could come with messiness as well. Like, it's not completely where the researcher is the all powerful person who goes ahead and does things, and it's just clean. Like, it's not. So finally, as to just conclude, um, as a female researcher, my doctoral fieldwork was peppered with several instances of sexualized harassment, which range from bodily harm to suggestive remarks. Experiences of sexualized harassment and rape in the field have often been documented by other researchers and scholars too. And one piece of text that I read a very long time ago was by Eva Morales, I think. And what was interesting about the text was how she says that towards the end, she had to even use a pseudonym for herself because she had to protect the anonymity of the interlocutor who went ahead and had harassed her. Because we're also bound by the do no harm thing to our interlocutors. We're also bound by doing ethical research where when you finally grapple with harassment, rape, or other forms of vulnerabilities, it gets very difficult to talk about it even when it is documented, but also as methodological training in universities, because all of this happens outside the realm of the university. Most often there's no support. Like, universities think that this is an individual problem rather than something that's systemic, that rather than something that's baked into and built into the very nature of how fieldwork occurs. So even though these things have been documented, we still grapple with the familiar disciplinary silence, right, which obscures relational vulnerabilities that are experienced by diverse scholars who identify as indigenous, Dalit, women, Black, and so on and so forth. And discounting these diverse and asymmetrical experiences in conversations about fieldwork, both as an episteme but also as a method, becomes problematic because we continuously then reproduce particular tropes, particular sanitized ideas of what it means to do good field work, which then affects the next generation of scholars who go in and think that, okay, this is the only way to do good field work. So it becomes then something that reinforces a partial truth. And this partial truth then sustains very troubling perceptions of fieldwork and overlooks its embodied and engendered nature, something that we should really start um, refocusing and rethinking and sort of, uh, you know, thinking differently, but also articulating so that we don't reinforce the same sort of structures. So I leave it at that. Um, but yeah.
Thank you so much, Meenakshi. Thank you for presenting your work with us and especially your experiences. It takes a lot of courage and resilience to be able to work through it and grapple and share. Your work expands the ambit of fieldwork, how we can't discount these experiences, which are very much there. So thank you very much for that. Now I invite Jigeesha to please come in and share any insights or questions that she may have had.
Uh, am I audible? Oh, thank you for bringing all of these conversations on the table. And I'm also so very sorry that all of that happened with you. But also, as Chetna said, you're very, very brave. With that, I have two major questions, which I'll ask which I ask together, and then probably you can answer them however you feel like. This also gives the audience time to type out any questions that they have in the chat box. What I've understood from your text and from this talk right now is that truth is also a resource in the field work, right? So you conceal some, you tell some, you do for various reasons, of course. So in your case, you didn't want to sabotage the population you were working with, so you didn't tell the truth that needed to be like said. And there are some truths that you cannot say to protect yourself, right? With that, with this resourceful understanding of truth, my question is that how can the research community then navigate this uh, also the fluid understanding of truth, but also this distinction between truth which is used for self protection and a truth uh, a silencing that is being structurally imposed on the ethnographer. In your case, the silencing that you could not, of course, go ahead and share what the bureaucrat or the person there was doing. So, yes, this is my first question. I hope it's clear. The second question is your understanding of body in the field work is also very new and interesting. So the body has a textuality to it. It again is fluid like truth. So, as you said, like one changes personality when one goes into field, or the personal collapses with the professional in the field. My question is this different way of perceiving the body, uh, does this result in valid research outcome? Is it beneficial to the academic discipline? Like, does bringing in vulnerability becomes methodologically productive or not? And if yes, then in what ways? These are my major questions. We also have one question in the chat box. Do you want me to read that aloud? Uh, uh,
I'll first take your questions and then I'll go back to the box questions. But these are very good questions, Jigeesha. They're very good. So I'll start with your second question first and then go to the first question because I think that the first question requires a little more thinking. Um, so the body, yes, has a textuality, but primarily, correct me if I'm wrong, primarily what you're asking me is that given how we tend to do certain things and how the personal and the professional collapses, etc., this has the potential to then impact research outcomes. So, would vulnerability then be a valuable tool to think of in research? So, I've understood you correctly? Yeah. Okay. Um, so, the good thing about anthropology and ethnography is that, at least from my perspective, and others have different perspectives, is that there is no universal truth because you are the person who's going into some place to do research. So your data is already partial simply because who you are really tends to impact how people resonate and talk to you. I mean, I can give you an example of a colleague who works on nutrition in the ICDS system, but because he is a he, women don't find it comfortable to talk to him, you know. Um, and there are these ways in which gender and other things come in. So you're already anyway going to produce a partial truth. So there is no universal, one thing. But the reason vulnerability becomes an important way to think, relational vulnerabilities become an important way to think about the partiality of the truths and the partiality of the ethnographic vignettes we produce, is that we can then sort of put in place that these are the vulnerabilities that allow me to access my field site in a particular way. And therefore, this then changed the nature in which I asked my research questions, how I was responded to, how people perceive me, because the information comes through you. And ethnographic writing finally is you textualizing your interlocutors, of course, but also you engage with them. And there is a lot of um, I mean, it is qualitative research. The granularity brings in the veracity and the validity, etc., but it's always partial. It's also like scientific research, right? I mean, in the sense that the laboratory is also socially constructed. It's not that there is this, clean, sanitized space where things, like, all of that is part of a particular kind of socially produced stuff. So that way, vulnerability and relational vulnerability have important ways to think about why, when two people do the exact same research in the exact same place, it's still not the exact same. Uh, it's just different, and that has a lot of methodological rigor, because we're then able to understand how people also respond to questions, how much we are able to speak with people, how much we're able to forge relationships. So I leave that at that. As far as truths, and this also connects to your first question about self-protection, etc., I think that a lot depends on power relations too. So, for instance, sometimes people have to hide their identity to um, engage with interlocutors, especially if their interlocutors are positioned in higher power structures. So, when I work with bureaucracies, I don't. At least in my recent research, where I have to engage a lot with bureaucracies, until and unless I'm asked explicitly, I don't talk about my political beliefs, because I know that it can put me at risk. And it's the same with some of my other colleagues as well. There are ways in which you talk about your research, because one, you do no harm to your interlocutors, but not all of your interlocutors. Um, well, let me rephrase it. A lot of your interlocutors, if you're studying up, they do come from powerful positions, and they do have ways in which they can follow you. Like during my doctoral research, for instance, I had certain parts of certain state actors following me around, So there are only certain things that you're able to say, and that is not lying. It's not also being untruthful, because it's just navigating your own relationship, and that is a constant tussle. um, so there are the other silence that I'm talking about, especially with relational vulnerabilities, is the silence that's imposed by the university, because it's not like your interlocutor is asking you not to talk about any of these things. The university, however, has specific demands as to what is okay. So, for instance, if you do go through sexualized harassment, um, and then you decide to talk to your supervisor or your donor, etc., the donor's concern is that, okay, I've given you money. Are you able to finish this up? Or are you not? The university's concern then is, are you going to be a problematic person to work with in the future? Should we give you the job or should we not? So it's from the side of the university, how it affects your career, how people then look at your work, how um, whether your entire identity then also becomes somebody who's gone through sexual harassment and assault, rather than, that this being a part of your very nature of work. And that's the thing, right? I mean, when we talk about corporate jobs, we can think there is HR policy, there is this, there is that. It's sort of laid out. I don't know how many universities actually have that. In the university that I was at, there was a risk assessment, but it also clearly said at the end that the risks are your own, even though it's systematic. um, so that is a different kind of silencing that works, which is in our writing, and also how we materially textualize our own research. Because if more people wrote about it, if more people wrote it in the introduction to their monographs, it would also not be something of a taboo. But the other thing which relates to self-protection, as you said, I don't necessarily think of it as hiding the truth. It unless, of course, you're in a position of power where, let's say, if you were working on a tricky conflict prone region, and if you have family members who are involved with state actors and actors that are responsible for, perpetrating violence, and that thing has to be shared, because that, if that has anything that impacts consent, needs to be shared, because consent is key. um, and there's no two ways about it, because people have the right to decide whether or not they want to, collaborate with you. But other things that you protect yourself, that's just reasonable. Because now, for instance, I don't do the things that I did as a doctoral student. Now I say that it's okay, safety first, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But that came with a little bit of age and experience. um, I'll just take Narinder's question. And Narinder, please feel free to call me Meenakshi. I am not used to ma'am. How do you, so the question is, can you tell me how to remain reflexive about our position in the field, especially when I'm doing ethnography? Um, I don't know if I'm the right person to answer it, because I don't have a single um, answer. So I'll tell you how I practice ethnography. For me, the thing is that, at least for my doctoral research, I worked on land and bureaucracy among Adivasi communities in Telangana, in a rural place. I'm not an Adivasi, I'm not from Telangana. So there are these things. One of the things that I would do is that, after I explained what my research was, and then I would ask if they were willing to speak with me, I would then tell them, that okay, this is my political belief. These are the ways in which I was. These are the aspects in which, or these are the conditions under which I do research. And I would ask them, do you have questions for me? So there were people would ask questions about caste, class, etc. I would be very forthcoming about my answers, and I would always make sure that consent was something that was constantly negotiated throughout. So just because somebody consented to be to partake in the research at 1 p.m. doesn't mean that it holds at 1:30 p.m. And the other thing about reflexivity is also how you ask questions and where your doubts come in. Like, if somebody were to say something, if you immediately have the need to challenge it, especially when you're doing field work with people who are less privileged than you, one thing that I would do is ask myself where this is coming from. And of course, reading works by people from the community, engaging with the communities to see if they're okay with the research. So that is at the process of research. But of course, going back and sharing your research insights is important, and constantly subjecting yourself, like constantly allowing it to be very clear that you are not the authority of anything, and that people can ask you questions. And this becomes very important, to have a dialogue, and it shouldn't be one of those things where, it's a monolith. And I think that that really helps with reflexivity, because one of the things that I was also thinking about is, why did I end up doing the research that I did? um, Especially as I was writing up my dissertation. And then in my thesis, of course, I've reflected quite a bit on it. But these are things that you have to consider when you also ask questions, where you use silences, when you know when to stop, when you know when to step back, and when you know when not to research. Like, sometimes you shouldn't do research at particular places. So I guess that's how being reflexive about one's positionality comes in. Yeah.
I have a question as well. Um, if there are more questions, then participants can, of course, turn on their mic and unmute themselves and ask, or in the chat box. But I would have ask a question. So you're critiquing the idea of a sanitized good worker because it's not tenable, and we need to take into consideration ethics of vulnerability while doing research work. So this is me just like thinking out loud. Then how do you imagine, as a researcher who's been in the realm for so long, how then do you imagine a feminist pedagogy of doing fieldwork? Fieldwork training for any student, budding student who might want to enter into the realm. So then, how do you imagine a feminist pedagogy of fieldwork training?
Actually, there's a new article that came out in Allegra Lab. I'll link it up here. And I think,
Chat box.
yes, I'll link it up in the chat box. And I think that that's a very So the article talks about why care is important throughout the process, and care does not presuppose vulnerability already, but it's still about, like the way she argues is that care does not have to presuppose vulnerability, but it's also about having these institutional forms of care where fieldwork becomes one of those things that is discussed, supported, knowing that you can stop. Like a lot of young researchers, and now when I interact with colleagues or master students, I tell them that if you find it's too much, you stop. You get out of your field, do whatever. It doesn't make you a failure, because it's interesting how many students, especially young students, really feel that if things are not working, so this could be that long waits are involved, or if people are not talking, or if suddenly something happened, it could be really random, a storm, something else. This idea that you've become a failure because you're not able to get through. And I think that a lot of feminist work, especially with feminist geographers and other black feminist writing, and even writing from like anti-caste writing, for instance, there is a way in which support and care and empathy, they don't make your fieldwork, um, it's not like any of this sort of makes your fieldwork less valid, or it doesn't make it neat. It's just that when you bring in all of these things, you're able to undertake a fieldwork that's also very ethical, both to your interlocutors but to yourself. And that form of care needs to come in at every level, both before field work, where you read, you understand, you understand that there's the praxis. I mean, we all know that field work may not go as per plan, but we don't necessarily, we think of it as, there is a shutdown here, there's a curfew there is this or there is that, but there are other forms of things. You could fall sick. Um, and it's things like that. And it means that of course you have to recalibrate your research, but you can also pause. It's okay to pause. And institutions, if they approach this with care, that means that they would support you financially, they would support you, because not all students have the finances to do field work. And it's an expensive undertaking. We don't talk about how expensive field work can be. Um, and that is what an institution, like if care was centered around the practice of fieldwork and the praxis of fieldwork, and if you think of vulnerabilities as not bad things, but things that sort of allow you to figure out what are the functionalities and capabilities that you're able to sort of, anchor your fieldwork in, you would do better fieldwork. Universities would also benefit from it, professors would benefit from it, and students would do better work as well. Um, but I'll link the article down here because I do think that um, it is actually quite a good piece, even though she talks about other stuff as well. But yeah.
Are there any other questions? Thank you for the link. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I have one. And if Chetna would allow, I would.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Meenakshi. Uh, this was a great presentation for three reasons. Of course, both Jigeesha and Chetna have congratulated you for coming out and talking about your experience. I don't want to focus on that because I'm sure that you've already gone through a certain, I would say, a mental process to be here. But the other two reasons that I think your presentation and the conversation that you're trying to do is important is because it is actually encouraging us to work on the method that takes into consideration, if not for a lack of better word, and borrowing from you, the vulnerabilities and the structural vulnerabilities that come into place. So the second reason that it's an important contribution and an intervention is for us to go back and then start looking at how do we do methods differently. And I think one of the things that you're probably also saying is that it starts at the university with the structure, with the way we look at fieldwork, with the way we imagine it, the way we've do we have insurances, concerns, where when we go to ethics committee to talk about our work, what are the ethics of the researcher, but what are the ethics of the university towards the researcher who's literally a lone wolf or a lone cat, whichever way we want to look at it in the field. So for all these three reasons, I think this is a very important presentation, and I hope that you kind of take out the time to kind of develop this into a larger paper, and a more sustained conversation of this sort. I think would really help all of us in Method. So that, on that congratulating note, I have questions. So I was, of course, I'm sure that I've read it elsewhere as well, but immediately what came to my mind was the introduction that Martha Nussbaum wrote for her book Upheavals of Thought. And she starts, and I don't necessarily need the audience or you to be acquainted with that work, but it came to my mind when you were speaking, and where she says that she took an overnight flight to be in a different country to make a presentation when she had a lot of grief within her about her mother's passing away. And she said while she was preparing for that lecture, she kept thinking that she has to speak about ethics and she has to speak about emotions. And she has to kind of, come out of her body and reflect on questions without really bringing her personal into it, and her current state of her passions and emotions into it. And when I heard you say that after the said incident, you went back to your field the next day and the next day and the next day, as if you had kind of you had to come out of that bodily experience, keep it aside, and then keep going. And I was wondering, again, from a method point of view, that there's a certain way in which we've been trained in academics, especially with respect to ethnography, fieldwork, to bring out the least passioned way of putting our work across. That there needs to be a certain reflexivity, as one of the questions was pointed out. How do you maintain objectivity, neutrality? These are real concerns. They're taught in research method papers across universities, at least in India. And I was wondering, is there also a need to push for a conversation on passion as as credible way of talking about work? This particular another fieldwork book that I can't really recall at the moment, was talking about how the researcher was pregnant at the time that she was researching on pregnant women, and the fact that she was pregnant helped her gain trust and access, and there were shared vulnerabilities with respect to how they were experiencing their pregnancy. But she also talked about how difficult it was for her to be a pregnant woman on the field and doing her research. And I was wondering, is it okay to write about, or write in a way, like, should our thesis also reflect the passion bit of it, and this need to be objective and reflexive in a manner where we step back and ask ourselves where it's coming from? Maybe it is coming from a certain place, and there is no harm, I'm suggesting, if we were to think out loud, in terms of shifting towards writing thesis, or writing, bringing our field to writing in a manner uh, which is not separated from passion. So that is me thinking out loud, and I would like to know what you think about it. Thank you.
Thanks. That's such a wonderful question. And I agree with you, because I have this huge issue with people talk about objectivity in research, and I think that it lacks nuance. Um, for instance, if we were to talk about other stuff, so let's put a pause on everything that we've been speaking about, but stuff like so there are anthropologists who research at CERN, and they talk about how instruments are calibrated. And when you start questioning scientists as to what goes into the calibration, you realize that there's a huge social production of the data that goes into it. But we don't question the scientists at CERN about objectivity or not, and also, the good thing about a lot of the social sciences is that we've discussed and dwelled on positivist thinking, etc., etc. And I think that there is a lot we can learn from the granularity of experiences that we're bringing in, because these are the things that are missed out when we only look at people as data and people as statistics and people as like these quantifiable, small, divisible units, because they exist in relationships, and relationships are messy. So social science research has to be messy. Like, it cannot be devoid of messiness. But I do think that the personal is political, and you cannot write research without materializing yourself, materializing your beliefs, materializing your ideology, because it's all there. Whether we write it or not, even data collection is impacted by all of that. It's just that when you write about it, it becomes a more honest piece of research, because the person who's reading your work understands where you're coming from as well. And that's a very important methodological thing. And this could be, let's take the RSS for instance. If you're a left leaning person researching the RSS and a right leaning person researching the RSS, there's obviously going to be differences in just how access comes in, or any other thing, going to a hospital and researching the hospital. But if you sort of write down the ways in which, and it's not just about positionality, but also how your beliefs transform the field, and when you put that down on paper, I don't necessarily think that it takes away from the research. I think it just makes it a more honest piece. It makes it easier for the audience to see where you came from and how what were your battles doing field work as well, like with the lady, with the researcher who was pregnant and undertaking research, etc. Because it also puts certain things into context, right? So if she were, let's say, 7 months pregnant, there's only a certain amount of time that she can spend doing research, and that's not a limitation, but it's part of that very nature of how care also manifests. Or let's say, and Ruth Behar has this wonderful book called The Vulnerable Observer. And I'm paraphrasing this very badly, but there is this thing that the right kind of anthropology you do at some point, she says, is the one that breaks your heart. And if it has to break your heart, you need to be present with the people that you're working with, and you need to be empathetic, you need to put your heart into it as well. And those things don't make for bad research, it actually makes for great research. And a case in point is also um, Lawrence Ralph's book. I forget what it's called. It's something about prisons in the black box or whatever. And he basically just researches these letters. And it's because his heart and soul is in that book, in terms of both writing and etc., that it makes it excellent research. And we shouldn't shy away from that. I really think that we should embrace it, because it's valuable methodologically, it's valuable as a thing to think through, and it's valuable in terms of how you just access places, how do you build relationships, like what are the parameters that allowed you to build these relationships with people. It just makes it for more honest, ethical, but also good research, because it allows people to see that, okay, these are the conditions that led you to build these alliances and collaborate, or whether you did not collaborate at all. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Chetna, to you, if there are more questions.
No, and I don't see any more questions as well. I think bring this session to a close. Lastly, I would like to thank Meenakshi for sharing such an honest and deeply reflective account of what it means to inhabit the field as both a researcher and also a vulnerable body. Uh, a very special thanks to Jigeesha for being the discussant and steering the conversation in a fruitful way, and the participants for joining us. We look forward to hosting you all next Saturday for the Baithak, and that is it. Wait, there's a new message. Oh, okay. Okay, I thought that's the question and take it out.
No, it's an important comment. I genuinely think I'm on WhatsApp in the background that this was one of the better sessions and a very good session that we've had. So we need to congratulate Meenakshi for it. And Nikita says it was an absolute pleasure. Thank
It
you
was
so
a
much.
heartfelt conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And it was really, really nice to speak with all of you and see all of you. So, yeah.
Thank you. So, I think we can end it now and we'll see you all for the next TheDaak Baithak. Thank you, Meenakshi.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.